Kim, it's so nice to have you here, and of course you do represent the Embroiderers Guild of America. And
Yes.
when I first had another guest on the show several years ago, I thought, embroidery, that's what I did on my little tea towels when I was about 6 or 8 years old.
And that's the perfect place to start.
And it's so much fun. I just couldn't imagine doing anything like this. I mean, I didn't know this is called embroidery. So what is the two types that we're going to do today?
Today we're talking about pulled and drawn
Pulled
thread.
and drawn.
Drawn embroidery. And it's really a perfect step after you've done cross stitch and you're comfortable with counting threads. It's a great way to go on. They're a little bit different with the pulled thread that we're talking about here. The stitches do all the work. But depending on how tightly you work the stitches and what order that you work them in, you can get a variety of different patterns. If you look at the leaves on this little piece, you can see that each one of the leaves is different, and it's all the same thread, and of course it's the same fabric because you just start out with a blank piece of fabric to embroider on that.
How interesting. I would have never thought these were the same.
Yes, they are.
And this is drawn.
This is pull thread.
Oh, okay. This is pulled.
Pull thread.
And this is the drawn.
Yes, and it is a confusing set of terms. And the way I keep it straight in my head is with drawn thread, you're actually withdrawing or removing some threads.
It should be called withdrawn, shouldn't it?
Right. Withdrawn thread. So, for example, on this piece, this is a bookmark that I made, and I like this kind of embroidery because it's reversible on both sides. So it's very nice for something like a guest towel or a bookmark where people are going to see both sides of it.
And it's just as pretty on either side.
It is. It's a really good technique for that. But this is the sample that I made that shows exactly how I prepared this piece of fabric before I did the embroidery on it. So I pulled out a couple of threads along here to make the hem stitch edge. And then I pulled out probably about 12 threads here.
So did you count up to a certain point and then start pulling the 12 threads? Is that how you do it?
I do it. What I think on this sample you can see the best.
Do you just leave tails hanging when you clip them on one side?
No, that would look really messy, and we want it to be really pretty. What you do is you pull out every other thread.
Oh, okay.
And then you leave one and you weave it back in just like you would do with yes, exactly, with a tapestry needle. And as you do it, you get a very finished edge that's quite strong. But it's a good point. If you don't do something to secure these threads, they start moving around, and that would make your piece fragile. So part of what you do when you do the embroidery, this is called hem stitching. It helps secure these fabric threads and strengthen it so they don't break. So this is one pattern you can do where the threads are paired together and you get strong vertical lines. This is one where you pair them slightly different and you can get a lovely zigzag going. And this is actually the same as this one, except that I have taken another piece of thread and gone back and twisted the pairs together to change the shape.
Would you ever use a totally different thread, like, I'm just going to say like pink?
You certainly could, and I think if we go back and we look at the bookmark, it's the same stitch here, except that I chose a piece of satin ribbon.
Oh, okay.
So you can definitely add different colors in there if you wanted to add some color.
It's really hard for me to envision it. And you say it's really not that difficult if you're patient and you can count.
If you can count, because you do the same stitch all the way across, and unlike counted cross stitch where you're reading a graph and you're changing colors of thread, generally this is always done with a thread that matches the fabric in color and in weight. With pulled and drawn thread, what the stitch does, how it manipulates the fabric threads, is usually more important than the stitch itself. But you get kind of a ragged edge when you're doing the pull thread. So if you look at this piece and this piece, you can see I have gone back in
sort of outlined it.
Yes, with just a chain stitch.
And that just sort of covers it up. finishes it out.
And the nice thing about these is these two techniques, they work really well with other kinds of embroidery stitches. These little motifs in this particular towel are just satin stitch.
Oh,
just counted satin stitch.
Which is a very basic stitch if you know how to
Yes.
do some sewing and embroidering.
And here you can see I have the pull thread or the drawn thread where this open gray stripe is, because I backed it with a gray satin so my design would show up more. And piece is worked in basic cross stitch. The cross
So what
stitch
if you hadn't have thought about that before you started? Can you go in and add the gray backing fabric?
Oh yes, that's
Okay.
actually part of the framing.
Oh, it is. Okay.
So the fabric itself is all white. I chose to use gray thread because I wanted piece to show up. And I used some other embroidery stitches in here because this is very textural. A lot of this is about texture. And I wanted it to look kind of like it was snowing, so I added lots of silver line beads in there.
It's amazing, though, that this is all called embroidery.
It is.
That's what I
it
think is
is.
interesting. Do you have a favorite type of embroidery you like to do?
Well, if it's counted thread, these two are my favorites because basically you take a plain piece of fabric and then you have the pleasure of creating a piece of lace out of it.
So you would have to know before you start that you're going to need a piece this long and have this type of opening.
Yes.
So would you say that it would be nice if you had that piece of fabric to go ahead and make it 24 inches long? Can you stop and start?
You can. Usually it's better to plot it out on a little piece of graph paper. You don't have to plot every stitch, but it's a good idea to do a little
Estimate.
bit of mouth. Yes, and say, okay, I'm using a thread that has 25 threads to an inch because you use a even weave fabric. And so then I just draw a little square and I say, okay, this area is 125 threads by 12 threads or whatever I'm going to do.
Well, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much. This is fascinating. Thank you for showing it to us.
You're very welcome.